The first free practice session for the Canadian Grand Prix did not allow Ferrari to collect complete data. Charles Leclerc's crash in the first free practice session, which happened right at the entry of Turn 3, forced Lewis Hamilton to take on the full workload of Friday's setup development. The British driver showed a decent feeling with the car, but honestly, not yet on par with his Maranello teammate. There's also an interesting aspect worth noting here. The graining suffered on the front axle really did not help in managing the handling of the SF25 in Sector 3, especially on a circuit where keeping the front tires in the right temperature window is particularly difficult. McLaren had an even more complicated start to the weekend, lacking balance until halfway through free practice 2 and showing a car that was honestly very oversteery. On the Montreal circuit, the Woking team introduced revised versions of both the front and rear wings, but so far they haven't found a clear performance benefit. Only after switching to the old specification in the final part of free practice 2 did the world champion cars improve, which in turn allowed Lando Norris to get closer to George Russell's excellent Mercedes. On the other hand, the McLaren MCL39 car was strong in race pace. However, Mercedes is very close, with all four drivers separated by just 0.05. The biggest difference between the two teams came from reduced drag on the straights. Specifically, George Russell and Oscar Piastri were averaging 5 km per hour more than Lewis Hamilton and 10 km per hour more than Max Verstappen before turn 13. The Red Bull driver may have opted for a lower engine mode to preserve the power unit. Lewis Hamilton's Ferrari, which was on average about 0.6 slower, also ran a less aggressive setup, apart from the first 2 laps, that is. Although it should be noted that the SF25 does suffer a bit in terms of efficiency. Furthermore, the world champion was actually lifting off earlier than his rivals when approaching turn 13, where he lost around a tenth. The final sector of the Canadian circuit really appears to be the most complex for the Maranello car. During the long run, Lewis Hamilton really struggled to carry speed through the middle of turn 10, which revealed his difficulty in getting the car turned in towards the apex. A similar issue actually occurred at the turn 13 to 14 chicane, where the Briton was about 6 km per hour slower on average compared to his direct rivals. At the same time, Ferrari lacks front-end grip due to graining. Tire performance drop-off led to various approaches in lap times at the beginning of the race simulation. The aim was to manage the onset of front-end graining, a limiting factor during long runs in free practice. This type of tire wear is linked to the thermal management of the front axle, which is not heavily loaded at the Montreal circuit where traction phases dominate. Lewis Hamilton took an aggressive approach at the start of the stint and encountered front-end grip loss earlier. Based on the telemetry data collected from the second free practice session at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve in Montreal, also due to traffic on track, his tire degradation was worse compared to his rivals. The Ferrari driver lacked front-end grip in Sector 3, precisely because of this pronounced wear. Unlike the first 2/3 of the lap, the final part features straights that lower tire temperatures and consequently reduce grip. Max Verstappen, on the other hand, managed his tire temperatures better thanks to a more cautious start to the stint. This approach might not be viable during the race, but it allowed him to get more out of the tire in the latter stages. Mercedes and McLaren encountered similar issues to Lewis Hamilton, albeit less severe, paying the price at the end of the stint. Ferrari started well but still needs to work to fight at the front. The absence of one car certainly limited the ability to compare data between the two drivers and, as a result, the Maranello team's performance development, an area where Charles Leclerc could definitely have made a difference. Lewis Hamilton repeatedly asked his engineer how to improve the final chicane, but without having Charles Leclerc's data to help guide him. As for the Monegasque, today he will have to rely on the references gathered by the 7-time Formula One world champion to properly prepare and build confidence during the final free practice session ahead of qualifying for the Canadian Grand Prix. The second free practice session of the Canadian Grand Prix revealed many technically interesting elements, but certainly didn't clear up doubts about the overall competitiveness levels of the teams. The session standings showed nearly all drivers within 1 second of each other, despite this only being a practice session, and featured some reshuffling of the usual order, with Max Verstappen 9th and Oscar Piastri 6th, for example. In terms of balance, the car that stood out most for cleanliness and effectiveness was, somewhat surprisingly, the Williams. The car from James Vowles' team, brought to 4th place by Alex Albon, was a pleasure to watch throughout the entire curve profile. Stable under braking and entry with a solid front end and a rear that stays composed, perfect through direction changes with a strong front and a rear that follows smoothly, and decent on exits thanks to good traction. Alex Albon clocked the best second sector time and was only 27 thousandths off Lando Norris's best in the first, only to lose all that advantage by the end of the lap with two poor driving moments at the hairpin, a bad exit that affected the entire straight, and the final chicane. If Williams sees a chance at a points-worthy weekend, Mercedes appears to be dreaming bigger. This is not entirely surprising. It has often been pointed out that the W16's strength is its traction, and on a track where longitudinal performance matters most, Mercedes is in its element. But that's not all. The new rear suspension now seems capable of unlocking extra performance, evidently thanks to a better understood setup path back at the factory, both in decoupled movements over curbs and in coupled movements under traction and braking. The result is high effectiveness, with George Russell only struggling in a couple of entries, especially in Sector 1, but then flying out of corners, darting forward on exits with a big gain in the final sector thanks to the first acceleration out of the hairpin. Even if there's a recorded top speed difference of 7 kilometers per hour between George Russell and Max Verstappen, who was fastest at 331 kilometers per hour at the breaking point. Kimi Antonelli's third place in the standings removes doubt about which was the best car over a single lap on Friday in Canada. Ferrari, running only Lewis Hamilton's car, gave good impressions from a driving perspective, though the final time was not remarkable. The SF25 looked well-balanced, but still has some imbalances to correct, most obviously in the final chicane. Race simulation runs were long and interesting, with everyone on medium tires and all running closely matched times. The Kick-Sauber cars tested the hard compound with decent results, which suggests that the medium and hard compounds could be the best choices for the race. The issue remains qualifying, with the medium often yielding better results than the C6 compound. Once again fast but difficult to make work. On race pace, George Russell was on top among those using mediums, along with Kimi Antonelli, who matched him step by step, ahead of Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, and Max Verstappen, all within a tenth and a half. Graining seems to be the biggest performance-limiting factor, making strategic planning very complex. In cooler conditions and with sliding, the hard tires suffer most from graining, but if temperatures match those of Friday, with over 40 degrees Celsius track temperatures, the soft compounds could also be at risk of graining and heavy performance drop-offs. In short, as usual, it's hard to make predictions. Mercedes has started strong, McLaren and Verstappen seem ready to respond, while Ferrari needs to find more consistency to join the front-running battle, pending Charles Leclerc's return to the car for the final free practice session. The Canadian weekend promises to be extremely interesting in many respects, and all that's left is to enjoy it to the fullest.